The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of Windsor Castle as Camilla Parker Bowles walked purposefully toward the Queen's private chambers. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floors, echoing through the vast hallways that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. As the new Queen Consort, Camilla had been granted access to many of the late Queen Elizabeth's personal belongings. The transition period had been challenging for everyone in the royal family, but particularly difficult for those who had served the Queen for decades. The staff, the guards, and even the senior members of the household still struggled to accept the changes that came with King Charles's reign. Camilla paused outside the ornate doors leading to what had once been Queen Elizabeth's most private sanctuary. Inside these rooms lay a treasure trove of memories, each item carefully preserved and catalogued by the royal household staff. Dresses from state dinners, jewelry worn to historic events, and personal mementos that told the story of a remarkable 70-year reign. Her daughter, Laura Lopes, had recently announced her engagement to a prominent businessman from London. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and Camilla wanted to ensure that Laura had something truly special to wear on her big day. What could be more perfect than incorporating a piece of royal history into the celebration? The Queen's longtime personal maid, Mrs. Henderson, greeted Camilla with a respectful curtsy but a noticeably cool demeanor. The elderly woman had served Queen Elizabeth for over 40 years and found it difficult to watch someone else going through her beloved monarch's personal effects. Her loyalty to the late Queen ran deeper than protocol or duty. It was personal, emotional, and unwavering. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "I've prepared the room as you requested. Everything has been properly organized according to occasion and date." Camilla nodded appreciatively and stepped into the room. The sight took her breath away. Dozens of garments hung in perfect rows, each one representing a moment in British history. There were the vibrant colors of Commonwealth visits, the subdued elegance of state funerals, and the sparkling grandeur of coronation celebrations. But it was a particular section at the far end of the room that caught Camilla's attention. Behind a velvet rope hung several white and cream-colored gowns, each one more breathtaking than the last. These were the Queen's most precious dresses, including the stunning bridal gown she had worn for her wedding to Prince Philip in 1947. The dress was a masterpiece of post-war craftsmanship. Despite the rationing and shortages that followed World War II, the gown had been created using the finest silk satin, decorated with over 10,000 seed pearls and crystals. The 15-foot train had been embroidered with intricate floral designs representing the different nations of the Commonwealth. It was not just a wedding dress. It was a symbol of hope and renewal for an entire nation, recovering from the devastation of war. Camilla approached the gown slowly, almost reverently. She could imagine the young Princess Elizabeth wearing it on her wedding day, nervous but radiant as she walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey. The dress had been featured in countless photographs and documentaries, becoming one of the most iconic wedding gowns in history. As she examined the intricate beadwork and delicate lace, an idea began to form in her mind. The gown was undoubtedly too historically significant to be worn again in its entirety, but perhaps elements of it could be incorporated into Laura's wedding dress. Some of the lace, maybe a few of the pearls, or even a section of the train could be carefully removed and repurposed. Mrs. Henderson watched nervously as Camilla spent more and more time examining the bridal gown. The maid's instincts told her that something was amiss, but protocol prevented her from questioning the Queen Consort's intentions directly. She had witnessed many changes in the royal household over the years, but this felt different, more personal somehow. "Mrs. Henderson," Camilla finally spoke, turning to face the elderly servant, "I'd like to have this gown sent to my private chambers for closer examination. I'm considering having some modifications made for my daughter's upcoming wedding." The color drained from Mrs. Henderson's face. The idea of altering Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress seemed almost sacrilegious to her. This wasn't just any dress. It was a piece of British heritage that belonged in a museum, not at a private family wedding. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "perhaps we should consult with the Royal Archives Department first. They maintain detailed records of all historically significant items, and there may be specific preservation requirements for a gown of this importance." Camilla's expression hardened slightly, She wasn't accustomed to having her decisions questioned, especially by household staff. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but I believe I'm quite capable of making decisions regarding family matters. Please arrange for the gown to be transported to my chambers this afternoon." The maid nodded reluctantly, knowing she had no choice but to comply with the queen consort's wishes. However, as soon as Camilla left the room, Mrs. Henderson knew she would have to inform someone about what had just transpired. The Queen's wedding dress was too important to British history to be modified without proper consultation. Later that afternoon, as palace staff carefully transported the precious gown to Camilla's private quarters, word began to spread throughout the castle. Servants whispered in corridors, and senior staff members exchanged concerned glances during their daily meetings. The news eventually reached the ears of Colonel James Morrison, the head of the Queen's Guard, who had served the royal family with distinction for over 20 years. Colonel Morrison was a man of principle and tradition. He had taken a personal oath to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the dignity and heritage of the monarchy itself. The thought of Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress being altered for a private ceremony struck him as deeply inappropriate and potentially damaging to the royal family's reputation. That evening, as Camilla examined the gown more closely in her private chambers, she remained unaware of the growing concern among the palace staff. She carefully studied each detail, imagining how certain elements might look incorporated into a new design for Laura. The pearls would make beautiful accent pieces, and some of the lace could create stunning sleeves or a veil. She had already contacted a discreet dressmaker in London, someone who specialized in working with vintage materials and understood the importance of confidentiality. The plan was to have the most beautiful elements of the Queen's gown carefully removed and incorporated into an entirely new dress that would make Laura's wedding day truly unforgettable. As night fell over Windsor Castle, Camilla felt satisfied with her decision. She believed she was honoring the late Queen's memory by ensuring that such beautiful craftsmanship would be seen and appreciated by a new generation. In her mind, this was a touching tribute that would create a meaningful connection between her family and the royal heritage they had become part of. However, the storm that was about to erupt would challenge everything she thought she knew about royal protocol and the deep emotional connections that bound the palace staff to their late monarch's memory. The next morning brought an unexpected chill to Windsor Castle that had nothing to do with the weather. Colonel Morrison had spent a sleepless night wrestling with his conscience, torn between his duty to respect the chain of command and his deeper obligation to preserve the integrity of royal traditions. By dawn, his decision was made. He requested an urgent meeting with Sir Edward Young, the private secretary to the king, hoping to resolve the matter diplomatically before it escalated further. The two men had worked together for years and shared a mutual respect for royal protocol and the delicate balance required to maintain the monarchy's reputation. Sir Edward received the news with visible shock. His usually composed demeanor cracked slightly as he processed the implications of what Camilla was planning. The Queen's wedding dress wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a national treasure that millions of people around the world had admired and cherished. The thought of it being dismantled for a private wedding filled him with dread. "Are you absolutely certain about this information, Colonel?" Sir Edward asked, leaning forward in his chair. "The Queen Consort specifically mentioned altering the late Queen's bridal gown?" Colonel Morrison nodded grimly. Mrs. Henderson heard it directly from Her Majesty's lips. The dress has already been moved to the Queen Consort's private chambers, and according to our sources, she's been in contact with a dressmaker in London. The private secretary rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This was precisely the kind of controversy that could damage the royal family's reputation, especially so soon after Queen Elizabeth's passing. The British public was still mourning their beloved monarch, and any perceived disrespect to her memory would be met with fierce criticism. "We need to handle this delicately," Sir Edward said finally. "Perhaps I should speak with His Majesty first, explain the situation, and let him address it with the Queen Consort privately." But Colonel Morrison shook his head. "With respect, sir, King Charles is currently in Scotland on official duties and won't return for 3 days. By then, it may be too late." Mrs. Henderson overheard the Queen Consort scheduling an appointment with the dressmaker for tomorrow afternoon. The urgency of the situation was becoming clear. If they waited for King Charles to return, the damage might already be done. Once even a single pearl or piece of lace was removed from the historical gown, its integrity as a preserved artifact would be compromised forever. Meanwhile, in her private chambers, Camilla was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her decision. She had spent the morning on the phone with her daughter Laura, excitedly describing her plans for incorporating elements of royal history into the wedding dress. Laura, though initially hesitant about using something so significant, was gradually warming to the idea as her mother described the exquisite craftsmanship and the honor it would represent. "Think about it, darling," Camilla said, holding her phone while examining the intricate beadwork on the gown's bodice. "You'll be wearing pearls that were sewn by hand over 70 years ago, lace that has been part of royal history. It's not just a dress, it's a legacy." Laura's enthusiasm grew as her mother spoke. The idea of having such a unique and meaningful wedding dress was certainly appealing, especially given the family's new position within the royal hierarchy. It would be a way of demonstrating their rightful place in the lineage, while creating something entirely new and personal. The dressmaker, Ms. Victoria Ashworth, arrived at the castle that afternoon as scheduled. She was a woman in her 60s who had worked with several members of high society and understood the importance of discretion in her profession. However, even she seemed taken aback when she saw the gown she was being asked to modify. "Your Majesty," Ms. Ashworth said carefully, "I must say this is quite an extraordinary piece. The historical significance alone makes it almost priceless. Are you quite certain you want to make alterations to the original garment?" Camilla waved dismissively. "Ms. Ashworth, I'm not asking you to destroy the dress. I simply want you to carefully remove some of the decorative elements so they can be incorporated into a new design for my daughter. Surely someone of your skill and experience can accomplish this without damaging the base fabric." The dressmaker nodded reluctantly, though her professional instincts screamed against the idea. She had worked with many vintage garments throughout her career, but nothing quite this significant. Every pearl, every stitch, every piece of lace on this dress had been placed there with the intention of creating something that would last forever, unchanged and unaltered. As Ms. Ashworth began her preliminary examination of the gown, word of her presence at the castle reached Colonel Morrison through the network of staff communications that kept the household running smoothly. His worst fears were being realized. The alteration process was actually beginning. Unable to wait any longer for diplomatic solutions, Colonel Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He marched directly to Camilla's private chambers, his military bearing evident in every step. Years of service had taught him that sometimes direct action was the only way to prevent a catastrophe. The Queen Consort's personal secretary tried to stop him at the door, explaining that Her Majesty was in an important meeting and couldn't be disturbed. But Colonel Morrison's determination was unshakable. He had served Queen Elizabeth personally for decades, and he would not stand by while her most precious possession was being dismantled. "I need to speak with the Queen Consort immediately," he said firmly. "This is a matter of urgent importance regarding royal property and protocol." Inside the chamber, Camilla looked up in surprise as her secretary announced Colonel Morrison's arrival. She was not accustomed to being interrupted, especially by someone she considered to be merely a member of the security staff. Her expression showed clear annoyance at the intrusion. "Colonel Morrison," she said coolly, "I wasn't expecting you. What could possibly be so urgent that it couldn't wait for a proper appointment?" The colonel stood at attention, his face serious and his voice steady. "Your Majesty, I've come to discuss the matter of Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. I believe there may be some misunderstanding about its status and significance." Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly. She could sense where this conversation was heading, and she didn't appreciate having her decisions questioned by someone she viewed as subordinate to her position. The room seemed to grow tenser as Ms. Ashworth quietly continued her examination of the gown, pretending not to listen to the exchange. "Colonel Morrison," Camilla replied, her tone becoming noticeably colder, "I fail to see how this is any concern of yours. This is a family matter, and I am quite capable of making decisions about family heirlooms without input from the security staff." The colonel's jaw tightened slightly, but his military training kept his voice level and respectful. "With greatest respect, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress is not simply a family heirloom. It is a piece of British national heritage that has been preserved in its original state for over 70 years. Any alterations to the garment would be irreversible and could be seen as deeply disrespectful to the late Queen's memory. The confrontation that had been building since the previous day was finally coming to a head. Camilla felt her authority being challenged in the most direct way possible, while Colonel Morrison found himself in the impossible position of having to directly oppose the wishes of a senior member of the royal family to protect what he saw as a sacred trust. The silence in the room became deafening as Camilla processed Colonel Morrison's words. Ms. Ashworth had stopped her examination entirely, sensing the dangerous shift in atmosphere. Even the Queen Consort's personal secretary, who had been quietly organizing papers in the corner, looked up with obvious concern. Camilla's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Being contradicted so directly by someone she considered to be staff was humiliating, especially in front of an outsider like the dressmaker. Her position as Queen Consort was still relatively new, and she was particularly sensitive about having her authority questioned or undermined. "Colonel Morrison," she said, her voice rising slightly, "I think you've forgotten your place. You are speaking to the Queen Consort of England, and I will not tolerate this insubordination. The dress belongs to the royal family, and as a member of that family I have every right to decide how it should be used." The colonel remained standing at attention, but his resolve didn't waver. He had faced down armed threats to the royal family's safety, and he wasn't about to back down from protecting their legacy and reputation. His voice remained steady, though those who knew him well could detect the controlled passion beneath his professional demeanor. "Your Majesty, I understand your position, but I have taken an oath to protect the crown and everything it represents. Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress is not just personal property. It's a symbol of continuity and tradition that belongs to the British people as much as it does to the royal family. Damaging or altering it would be seen by many as a betrayal of that trust." Camilla's anger reached a boiling point. The stress of her new role, combined with the constant scrutiny from both the media and palace staff, had been building for months. Being challenged so publicly, in front of a civilian contractor no less, was the final straw that shattered her composure. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the ornate walls of the chamber. "How dare you stand there and lecture me about my responsibilities? You're nothing more than a guard, and you will not dictate to me what I can or cannot do with items that now belong to my family." Ms. Ashworth winced at the outburst, wishing she could disappear entirely from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. She had worked for wealthy and powerful clients before, but she had never witnessed such a raw display of anger from someone in such an elevated position. The reverence she had felt for the royal family was quickly being replaced by shock and disappointment. Colonel Morrison's training kicked in, and he forced himself to remain calm despite the verbal assault. He had seen stress and pressure affect people in different ways throughout his military career, but this level of reaction told him that the situation was even more serious than he had initially thought. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "I am not trying to dictate anything to you. I am simply trying to prevent what I believe would be a serious mistake that could damage the reputation of the institution we all serve. The British people loved Queen Elizabeth deeply, and they will not forgive anyone they perceive as disrespecting her memory." His words only served to fuel Camilla's rage further. The implication that she might be disrespecting the late Queen struck at her deepest insecurities about her acceptance by the British public. She had spent years trying to win over a population that had once viewed her as the woman who broke up Charles and Diana's marriage. "Get out," she screamed, pointing toward the door. "Get out of my chambers immediately. And if I hear one more word of insubordination from you, I'll have you removed from your position permanently." The colonel didn't move immediately. His duty to protect the royal family included protecting them from themselves when necessary, and he could see that this situation was spiraling out of control. However, he also recognized that his continued presence was only making things worse. "Your Majesty," he said with a slight bow, "I will leave as you've requested, but I hope you will take some time to reconsider this decision before any irreversible actions are taken." As Colonel Morrison turned to leave, Camilla's fury found a final outlet. "And take your opinions with you. I don't need advice from someone whose job is to stand silently in doorways." The door closed behind the colonel with a soft click that seemed to echo through the now silent chamber. Ms. Ashworth stood frozen beside the precious gown, unsure whether she should continue with her examination or wait for further instructions. The Queen Consort's secretary busied herself with paperwork, clearly trying to pretend that the explosive confrontation hadn't just occurred. Camilla stood breathing heavily, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. Part of her felt justified in her anger. After all, who was a security guard to tell her how to handle family matters? But another part of her, a quieter voice in the back of her mind, wondered if perhaps the colonel had raised valid concerns. Ms. Ashworth finally broke the uncomfortable silence. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should postpone today's examination. I could return tomorrow when things are more settled." Camilla turned to look at the dressmaker, seeing uncertainty and concern in the woman's eyes. She realized that her outburst had been witnessed by someone outside the palace, someone who might talk to others about what she had seen. The potential for negative publicity suddenly became very real. "No," Camilla said firmly, trying to regain her composure. "We'll continue as planned. Colonel Morrison has no authority over family decisions, and I won't let his interference delay my daughter's wedding preparations." But even as she spoke the words, Camilla could feel doubt creeping into her mind. The colonel's mention of British public opinion had struck a nerve. She knew better than most how quickly public sentiment could turn against members of the royal family, and she had worked too hard to gain acceptance to risk it all over a wedding dress. Meanwhile, Colonel Morrison walked quickly through the palace corridors, his mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. He had been shouted at before in his military career, but never by someone whose reputation he was trying to protect. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He was being punished for trying to prevent what he saw as a potential disaster. He headed directly to his office to document the incident in an official report. Whatever happened next, there needed to be a clear record of his attempts to prevent what he believed would be a serious mistake. He also knew that he needed to inform Sir Edward Young immediately about how badly the situation had escalated. As he wrote his report, Colonel Morrison reflected on his years of service to Queen Elizabeth. She had been a woman of remarkable grace and dignity, someone who understood that her personal desires always came second to her duty to the crown and the British people. The contrast with what he had just witnessed couldn't have been more stark. The confrontation had achieved nothing positive, but it had clarified the battle lines. On one side stood those who believed in preserving royal traditions and protecting the monarchy's reputation, even if it meant challenging those in power. On the other side was a queen consort, determined to assert her authority and create her own family legacy, regardless of the potential consequences. The real tragedy was that both sides believed they were acting in the best interests of the royal family. The question now was whether any compromise could be found before the situation became even worse, or whether the conflict would escalate until it could no longer be contained within the palace walls. Word of the explosive confrontation spread through Windsor Castle like wildfire. The palace staff, who had already been whispering about the Queen's wedding dress, now had something far more dramatic to discuss. Within hours, nearly everyone from the kitchen staff to the senior advisors knew that Colonel Morrison had been shouted at by the Queen Consort. Mrs. Henderson, who had started this chain of events by reporting Camilla's intentions, felt a heavy weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She had served the royal household faithfully for decades and had never been involved in such controversy. As she went about her duties that afternoon, she could feel the eyes of other staff members following her, some sympathetic, others worried about their own positions. The elderly maid found herself constantly thinking about Queen Elizabeth, remembering how the late monarch had worn that beautiful dress on her wedding day. Mrs. Henderson had been just a young girl then, but she had seen photographs and newsreels of the ceremony countless times over the years. The dress represented hope and new beginnings during one of Britain's darkest periods, and the thought of it being cut apart for a private wedding made her physically ill. Sir Edward Young received Colonel Morrison's official report within the hour and immediately cancelled his afternoon appointments. The situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and he knew that urgent action was needed to prevent further damage. The problem was that King Charles was still in Scotland and couldn't be reached for several more hours. Due to his packed schedule of official engagements, Sir Edward called an emergency meeting with the other senior members of the royal household staff. The group included the Lord Chamberlain, the the master of the household, and several other officials who had served the royal family for decades. They gathered in a small conference room, their faces grave as they discussed the unprecedented situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sir Edward began, "we are facing a crisis that could have serious implications for the reputation of the monarchy. The Queen Consort's decision to alter Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress, combined with her confrontation with Colonel Morrison, has created a situation that requires immediate and careful handling." The Lord Chamberlain, an elderly man who had served through multiple royal transitions, shook his head in dismay. "In all my years of service, I've never encountered anything quite like this. The late Queen's wedding dress is practically a sacred artifact. The very idea of altering it is deeply troubling." The master of the household, responsible for the day-to-day operations of the royal residences, voiced practical concerns. "We also need to consider the staff morale situation. Many of our people are deeply upset about this, and they're looking to us for leadership. If we appear to condone the Queen Consort's actions, we risk losing the loyalty and respect of people who have served this family faithfully for decades." Meanwhile, in her chambers, Camilla was trying to focus on the dress examination with Miss Ashworth, but the confrontation with Colonel Morrison had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The dressmaker's obvious discomfort wasn't helping matters, and Camilla found herself second-guessing decisions she had felt confident about just hours earlier. Ms. Ashworth worked carefully and quietly, documenting the construction and condition of the gown while trying to remain as invisible as possible. However, her professional expertise made it impossible for her to ignore the historical significance of what she was examining. Every detail of the dress told a story, from the carefully rationed silk to the intricate embroidery that had taken months to complete. "Your Majesty," Ms. Ashworth said carefully, "I've completed my initial examination. The construction of this gown is truly extraordinary. The level of craftsmanship is unlike anything I've seen in modern dressmaking. However, I must warn you that removing any of the decorative elements would be extremely difficult and could potentially damage the base fabric." Camilla looked up from her own examination of the dress, frustration evident in her expression. "Surely you've worked with vintage garments before. This can't be that different from other restoration projects you've undertaken." The dressmaker hesitated before responding. "Your Majesty, this isn't a restoration project. Restoration means preserving and protecting original materials. What you're asking me to do is essentially the opposite, to deliberately alter and remove parts of a historically significant garment. I have to question whether this is truly in anyone's best interest." The doubt that had been growing in Camilla's mind suddenly crystallized. Here was another person, someone she had hired specifically for their expertise, questioning her decision. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and she found herself wondering if perhaps she had been too hasty in her plans. Her daughter Laura called just as these doubts were reaching their peak. "Mother, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning," Laura said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "I'm starting to wonder if using Queen Elizabeth's dress might not be the best idea. Some of my friends have expressed concerns about the appropriateness of altering such an important historical artifact." Camilla felt her carefully constructed plans beginning to crumble. The opposition from Colonel Morrison had been bad enough, but now even her own daughter was having second thoughts. The stress of the situation was becoming overwhelming, and she found herself snapping at Laura in a way that she immediately regretted. "Laura, I thought you understood how special this opportunity is," Camilla said, her voice tighter than she intended. "This is a chance to connect our family with royal history in a meaningful way. I can't believe you're letting other people influence such an important decision." Laura's response was measured but firm. "Mother, it's not about other people's influences. It's about doing what's right. The more I think about it, the more I realize that Queen Elizabeth's dress should remain exactly as it is. It's part of British heritage, and I don't feel comfortable being responsible for changing that." After the call ended, Camilla sat in silence, staring at the magnificent gown that had caused so much controversy. For the first time since this whole situation began, she allowed herself to really consider the possibility that she might be making a mistake. The dress was undeniably beautiful, and its historical significance was undeniable. Ms. Ashworth sensed the change in atmosphere and decided to risk offering her professional opinion more directly. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest an alternative? There are many beautiful vintage elements available from other sources. that could create a stunning wedding dress for your daughter, without compromising this particular garment. I work with several dealers who specialize in period lace and beadwork that would be much more appropriate for alteration. The suggestion made sense, but Camilla's pride made it difficult for her to admit that she might have been wrong. She had already invested so much emotional energy in this plan, and backing down now would feel like a personal defeat, especially after her confrontation with Colonel Morrison. As evening approached, the tension throughout Windsor Castle remained palpable. Staff members went about their duties with unusual quietness, and there was a sense that everyone was waiting for the next development in an unprecedented situation. The normal routine of palace life had been disrupted by the conflict between tradition and personal desire. Colonel Morrison spent the evening in his quarters, writing a more detailed report about the incident and its potential implications. He knew that his career might be in jeopardy as a result of the confrontation, but he also knew that he had acted according to his deepest principles and his oath to protect the crown. The question that hung over everyone involved was whether this situation could be resolved quietly within the palace walls, or whether it would eventually spill out into the public domain, creating a scandal that could damage the royal family's reputation at a time when they could least afford it. The next few hours would prove crucial in determining the ultimate outcome of this unprecedented crisis. The morning of the third day brought an unexpected development that would change everything. King Charles had cut short his official visit to Scotland after receiving urgent communications from Sir Edward Young. The private secretary had managed to reach the king during a brief break in his schedule and had provided a carefully worded summary of the situation without going into explicit detail about the confrontation. King Charles arrived at Windsor Castle just after dawn, his face showing the strain of the hurried journey and the weight of the news he had received. He had spent the entire flight back to England thinking about the delicate balance he would need to strike between supporting his wife and protecting the institution he now led. Sir Edward Young was waiting to meet with the king immediately upon his arrival. The two men had worked together for years, and Charles trusted his private secretary's judgment implicitly. However, this situation was unlike anything they had faced together before, involving as it did both personal family matters and broader questions of royal protocol. "Your Majesty," Sir Edward began as they walked toward the king's private study, "I'm afraid the situation has become more complicated since we last spoke. The Queen Consort's confrontation with Colonel Morrison has created significant unrest among the staff, and we're concerned about the potential for this matter to become public knowledge." King Charles nodded grimly. He had hoped that a quiet word with Camilla might resolve the matter, but it was clear that the situation had already escalated beyond simple family discussion. The mention of potential publicity particularly concerned him, as he was acutely aware of how quickly media attention could turn minor palace controversies into major scandals. In her chambers, Camilla was having breakfast when she received word that her husband had returned unexpectedly from Scotland. The news filled her with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was eager to have Charles's support in what she saw as an unreasonable challenge to her authority, but she was also worried about how the situation might appear to him. Ms. Ashworth had left the previous evening without completing her assessment, claiming that she needed time to consider the technical challenges involved in the proposed alterations. In reality, the dressmaker had been so uncomfortable with the entire situation that she was seriously considering withdrawing from the project entirely. Regardless of the potential loss of such a prestigious client, the Queen's wedding dress still hung in Camilla's chamber, a beautiful but now burdensome reminder of the controversy it had sparked. Every time Camilla looked at it, she felt a mixture of emotions: admiration for its craftsmanship, frustration with the opposition to her plans, and growing uncertainty about whether she was making the right decision. King Charles requested a private meeting with Camilla before speaking with anyone else about the situation. He wanted to hear her perspective directly and understand her motivations before making any decisions about how to proceed. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning in his private study, away from the curious ears of palace staff. When Camilla entered the study, she could immediately see the concern on her husband's face. Charles had always been supportive of her efforts to establish herself within the royal family, but she could sense that this situation was testing even his patience and understanding. "Camilla," he said gently, I've been briefed on what's happened with my mother's wedding dress. I think we need to discuss this matter carefully and consider all the implications involved." Camilla felt defensive immediately. She had hoped for unequivocal support from her husband, and his measured tone suggested that he might not automatically take her side in the controversy. The stress of the past few days had worn down her usual diplomatic instincts, and she found herself speaking more bluntly than she normally would. "Charles, I'm being treated like a criminal for wanting to share a piece of family history with my daughter," she said, her voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Your staff has been questioning my authority and treating me with disrespect. Colonel Morrison actually shouted at me in front of an outsider." King Charles raised his eyebrows slightly. According to the reports he had received, it was Camilla who had done the shouting, not Colonel Morrison. The discrepancy between her account and the official reports immediately concerned him, as it suggested that the situation might be even more complex than he had initially understood. "Camilla," he said carefully, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened during your conversation with Colonel Morrison. The reports I've received suggest that there may have been some misunderstanding about who said what." Camilla's face flushed as she realized that her husband had been given a different version of events. The knowledge that palace staff had been reporting on her behavior to the king felt like a betrayal, and it reminded her uncomfortably of the years when she had felt constantly watched and judged by those around Charles. "So you're taking their word over mine?" she asked, her voice rising. "Your own wife's account matters less than gossip from the servants?" King Charles remained calm, though he could feel the conversation heading in a dangerous direction. He had learned through years of experience that emotional confrontations rarely led to good outcomes, especially when they involved matters of such importance to the monarchy's reputation. "I'm not taking anyone's word over anyone else's," he said firmly. "I'm trying to understand what actually happened so that we can find the best way forward. But Camilla, I need you to understand that my mother's wedding dress isn't just a family heirloom. It's a piece of British history that the public holds sacred." The mention of public opinion struck the same nerve that Colonel Morrison had hit days earlier. Camilla had spent years trying to win acceptance from the British people, and the suggestion that this decision might damage her reputation was deeply troubling. However, her pride prevented her from backing down easily. "I'm not trying to destroy the dress, Charles," she said, her tone becoming more pleading. "I just wanted Laura to have something special, something that would connect her to your family's history. Is that really so wrong?" King Charles could hear the genuine emotion in his wife's voice, and he understood her motivations, even if he disagreed with her methods. The desire to create meaningful connections between their blended family and royal traditions was something he had encouraged in the past. However, this particular gesture crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "I understand what you were trying to do," he said gently, "but some things are too important to change, even with the best intentions. My mother's wedding dress represents hope and continuity for millions of people. Altering it even slightly would be seen as a betrayal of that trust." As they spoke, Colonel Morrison was meeting with Sir Edward Young and the other senior staff members to discuss the potential consequences of the situation. The colonel had submitted his formal report, but everyone involved knew that the real decision about how to proceed would have to come from King Charles himself. "The staff are deeply concerned," the Lord Chamberlain reported. "Many of them feel that if we allow this to proceed, it sets a dangerous precedent for how royal artifacts might be treated in the future. They're also worried about what this says about respect for the late Queen's memory." Colonel Morrison nodded grimly. "I've served this family for 20 years, and I've never seen the staff so united in their opposition to something. They feel that if they don't speak up now, they'll be failing in their duty to preserve royal traditions." Sir Edward Young listened to these concerns while keeping one eye on the clock. He knew that King Charles would need to make a decision soon, before the situation deteriorated further, or, worse still, leaked to the media. The thought of reading about this controversy in the tabloids made him feel physically ill. Back in the king's study, Camilla was beginning to realize that she was fighting a losing battle. The combined opposition from the staff, her own daughter's doubts, and now her husband's obvious concerns were wearing down her resolve. However, admitting defeat felt like acknowledging that she had been wrong from the beginning, something that was difficult for someone in her position to accept. "What do you want me to do, Charles?" she asked finally. "Should I just return the dress and pretend this whole thing never happened?" King Charles could hear the defeat in her voice, and part of him felt sorry for her. He knew that being queen consort was an incredibly difficult role, with constantly shifting expectations and very little room for error. However, he also knew that some mistakes were too costly to ignore. "I think returning the dress to its proper place would be the wise thing to do," he said gently, "and I think we need to find a way to repair the relationships that have been damaged by this situation." Colonel Morrison and the other staff members were acting out of loyalty to the institution, not out of disrespect for you. Camilla nodded reluctantly, finally accepting that her grand gesture for Laura's wedding would have to be abandoned. The weight of the past few days suddenly felt overwhelming, and she found herself questioning whether she would ever truly fit into the complex world of royal protocol and tradition. "Will you help me figure out how to make this right?" she asked, her voice smaller than it had been throughout their conversation. King Charles reached across his desk and took her hand. "Of course I will. We'll handle this together, as we handle everything else. But Camilla, we need to be very careful about how we move forward from here. The monarchy's reputation depends on our ability to show respect for the traditions that came before us." The resolution of the immediate crisis was beginning to take shape, but both of them knew that the deeper issues revealed by this confrontation would take much longer to address. The balance between personal desires and public duty, the integration of new family members into ancient traditions, and the delicate relationships between the royal family and their staff would all require ongoing attention and care. The afternoon, following King Charles's return, brought a series of carefully orchestrated meetings designed to restore order and dignity to Windsor Castle. The king had spent considerable time planning how to address the various relationships that had been damaged during the controversy, understanding that the way he handled this situation would set important precedents for his reign. The first meeting was with Colonel Morrison, who entered the king's study with the bearing of a man prepared to accept whatever consequences his actions might bring. Charles had always respected the colonel's dedication and integrity, and he wanted to ensure that the man's loyalty wasn't punished simply because he had been put in an impossible position. "Colonel Morrison," King Charles began, "I want to thank you for your service to this family and for your commitment to protecting the traditions that define the monarchy. Your actions over the past few days, while difficult, were motivated by the highest principles." The colonel's relief was visible, though he maintained his professional composure. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I hope you understand that I took no pleasure in opposing the Queen Consort's wishes. However, I felt that my duty to preserve royal heritage required me to speak up." King Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I do understand, and I want you to know that your position here is secure. However, I also need you to understand that going forward, any concerns of this nature should be brought to Sir Edward Young or myself before direct confrontation becomes necessary. We need to find ways to protect our traditions while also maintaining the respect and dignity that all family members deserve." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with both men working to establish protocols that would prevent similar situations in the future. Colonel Morrison left the meeting feeling vindicated in his actions, but also more aware of the complex dynamics that governed royal household management. Meanwhile, Camilla was meeting with Mrs. Henderson in what was perhaps the most emotionally charged conversation of the entire crisis. The elderly maid had been torn between her loyalty to the late Queen's memory and her duty to serve the current royal family, and the stress had taken a visible toll on her health and demeanor. "Mrs. Henderson," Camilla said, her voice much gentler than it had been during their previous interactions, "I owe you an apology. I realize now that my plans for the Queen's dress were inappropriate, and I should have listened to your concerns from the beginning." The maid's eyes filled with tears as she responded. "Your Majesty, I never intended to cause trouble or to challenge your authority. It's just that Queen Elizabeth's dress represents so much history, so many memories of better times. The thought of it being changed was more than I could bear." Camilla found herself genuinely moved by the woman's emotion. For the first time, she began to truly understand the deep personal connections that the long-serving staff members had with Queen Elizabeth and her possessions. It wasn't just about protocol or tradition. It was about love and loyalty that had been built over decades of faithful service. "I understand that now," Camilla said softly, "and I want you to know that the dress will be returned to its proper place immediately. It will remain exactly as Queen Elizabeth left it, unchanged and preserved for future generations to appreciate." The conversation marked a turning point in Camilla's understanding of her role within the royal household. She began to see that earning the respect of the staff wasn't just about asserting authority, but about demonstrating that she shared their commitment to preserving what made the monarchy special and meaningful. King Charles also met with Sir Edward, Young, and the other senior staff members to discuss lessons learned from the crisis. The private secretary had handled the situation with his usual diplomatic skill, but everyone involved recognized that clearer protocols needed to be established for handling similar conflicts in the future. "We need to create better communication channels," Sir Edward suggested. "Perhaps regular meetings where concerns can be raised and discussed before they escalate to crisis levels. We also need to ensure that all family members understand the historical significance of the items in their care." The king agreed enthusiastically. One of his goals for his reign was to modernize certain aspects of royal protocol, while strengthening the traditions that truly mattered. This crisis had shown him that achieving that balance would require ongoing dialogue and mutual respect among all members of the royal household. Ms. Ashworth, the dressmaker, received a phone call that afternoon informing her that her services would no longer be needed for the dress alteration project. However, Camilla personally spoke with her to explain that the decision had nothing to do with her professional competence and everything to do with a family decision to preserve the historical integrity of the garment. "I hope you'll consider working with us on other projects in the future," Camilla said. "Your professionalism during a very difficult situation was much appreciated, and I respect the concerns you raised about the appropriateness of the alterations." Ms. Ashworth accepted this gracefully, privately relieved that she wouldn't have to be responsible for altering such an important historical artifact. The experience had given her a new appreciation for the weight of responsibility that came with working for the royal family. That evening, Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress was carefully transported back to its proper location in the preservation rooms. Mrs. Henderson personally oversaw the process, ensuring that every detail was exactly as it should be. As she hung the gown in its designated spot, she whispered a quiet apology to her late queen's memory for allowing it to be moved in the first place. The crisis had lasted only a few days, but its impact on everyone involved would be much longer lasting. Camilla had learned important lessons about the difference between family heirlooms and national treasures, and about the deep emotional connections that bound the royal household staff to their traditions. Colonel Morrison had demonstrated that sometimes protecting the institution required taking personal risks, but he had also learned about the importance of finding diplomatic solutions before resorting to direct confrontation. The other staff members had seen that their concerns would be heard and respected when they were raised through proper channels. King Charles had faced his first major internal crisis as monarch and had handled it in a way that preserved both family unity and institutional integrity. However, he was also aware that this wouldn't be the last time he would need to balance competing interests and demands within the complex world of the modern monarchy. Laura Lopes, though disappointed about losing the opportunity to wear elements of such a historic dress, had ultimately felt relieved about not being responsible for altering a piece of British heritage. She and her mother began exploring other options for creating a meaningful and beautiful wedding dress that would honor royal traditions without compromising historical artifacts. The resolution of the immediate crisis had been successful, but everyone involved understood that the real test would come in the months and years ahead, as they worked to implement the lessons learned and build stronger, more respectful relationships within the royal household. 6 months later, Windsor Castle had settled into a new rhythm that reflected the lessons learned from the wedding dress crisis. The incident, which had initially seemed like it might cause lasting damage to relationships within the royal household, had instead become a catalyst for positive changes that strengthened the institution as a whole. Camilla had embraced her role as queen consort with a new understanding of the delicate balance between personal desires and public responsibility. She had instituted regular meetings with senior staff members, creating opportunities for open dialogue about traditions, protocols, and the reasoning behind various royal customs. These sessions had helped her appreciate the deep historical knowledge possessed by long-serving staff members and had given them a voice in shaping how traditions would be maintained and adapted. The queen consort had also become one of the strongest advocates for preserving Queen Elizabeth's legacy within the royal household. She had worked with museum professionals to create a comprehensive catalog of the late Queen's most significant possessions, ensuring that their historical importance would be properly documented and preserved for future generations. The wedding dress now resided in a climate-controlled environment with the most advanced preservation technology available. Colonel Morrison had been promoted to a new position that allowed him to serve as a liaison between the security staff and the royal family on matters involving historical artifacts and protocol. His experience during the crisis had demonstrated his unique understanding of both security concerns and preservation issues, making him invaluable in preventing similar conflicts in the future. The colonel had also been instrumental in developing new training programs for royal household staff, helping them understand when and how to raise concerns about potential threats to royal traditions. The protocols established after the crisis had created clear chains of communication that allowed problems to be addressed diplomatically before they escalated to confrontational levels. Mrs. Henderson had become something of a legend among the palace staff for her role in protecting Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress. Her knowledge of royal history and her dedication to preserving important artifacts had been formally recognized with a special commendation from King Charles himself. She had also been asked to mentor younger staff members, passing on her decades of experience and institutional knowledge. The elderly maid had found new purpose in her role as an unofficial guardian of royal heritage. She worked closely with historians and archivists to document the stories behind various royal possessions, ensuring that the emotional and historical significance of these items would be understood by future generations of staff members. Sir Edward Young had used the crisis as an opportunity to modernize certain aspects of royal household management while strengthening others. He had implemented new systems for tracking and managing historical artifacts, as well as improved protocols for family members who wished to use or modify items from the royal collection. The private secretary had also established regular briefings for new family members, helping them understand the historical significance of various royal possessions and the public's emotional connection to them. These briefings had become an essential part of preparing people for the unique responsibilities that came with royal status. Laura Lopes had indeed had a beautiful wedding, wearing a stunning dress that incorporated vintage lace and beadwork from the 1920s and 1930s. The choice had been perfect for her, creating a sense of historical connection without compromising any artifacts of national significance. The dress had been featured in several fashion magazines, with articles praising the thoughtful approach to honoring tradition while creating something entirely new. Laura's wedding had also become an example of how royal family members could create meaningful personal celebrations while respecting the broader responsibilities of their positions. The event had been well received by both the media and the public, demonstrating that it was possible to have both personal happiness and public approval. King Charles had emerged from the crisis with a stronger understanding of the complex dynamics that governed royal household management. He had learned that being an effective monarch required not just making good decisions, but also creating environments where good decisions could emerge from the collective wisdom of experienced advisors and staff members. The king had also gained a deeper appreciation for the emotional connections that bound people to royal traditions. He had come to understand that these traditions weren't just historical curiosities, but living symbols that provided comfort and continuity to millions of people around the world. Protecting them wasn't just about preserving the past, but about maintaining hope for the future. The crisis had revealed the importance of having clear processes for handling conflicts between personal desires and institutional responsibilities. The protocols developed in its aftermath had already prevented several potential problems from escalating, demonstrating that the lessons learned had real practical value. 1 year after the incident, Queen Elizabeth's wedding dress was featured in a special exhibition celebrating the late Queen's life and legacy. The display included detailed information about the dress's construction, its historical significance, and the role it had played in providing hope and inspiration during the difficult post-war period. Millions of visitors came to see the dress, many of them moved to tears by its beauty and the story it represented. Camilla attended the exhibition's opening ceremony, where she spoke eloquently about the importance of preserving historical artifacts for future generations. Her speech was well received, with many commenting on how much her understanding of royal responsibilities had deepened since becoming queen consort. "This dress represents far more than beautiful craftsmanship," Camilla said during her remarks. "It represents the hopes and dreams of an entire nation during one of our most challenging periods. Our responsibility is not just to preserve the physical object, but to honor the emotions and aspirations it embodies." The exhibition had become one of the most popular displays in royal history, demonstrating the enduring public fascination with Queen Elizabeth's legacy. The careful preservation of the wedding dress, which had once been at the center of such controversy, now served as a symbol of the royal family's commitment to honoring their heritage while building bridges to the future. The crisis that had begun with good intentions but poor judgment had ultimately strengthened every relationship it had initially threatened. Camilla had gained the respect of the royal household staff through her willingness to admit her mistakes and learn from them. The staff had gained a stronger voice in protecting the traditions they held dear, and the royal family as a whole had developed better systems for navigating the complex intersection of personal desires and public responsibilities. Years later, when historians wrote about the early days of King Charles's reign, the wedding dress incident would be remembered not as a crisis that damaged the monarchy, but as a turning point that demonstrated the institution's ability to learn, adapt, and grow stronger through adversity. It had shown that even in an ancient institution steeped in tradition, there was always room for wisdom, compassion, and positive change. The wedding dress itself continued to inspire visitors from around the world, its beauty undiminished by the controversy it had once sparked. It remained exactly as Queen Elizabeth had left it, a perfect symbol of continuity and hope that would continue to touch hearts and minds for generations to come.